The world is a dumpster fire of a mess right now. If you even try to look at the tangled web of alliances and antagonistic relationships across the world, you're bound to get a headache real quick. And if you feel that way too, you and I are not alone. Increasingly, the US military, US intelligence, US national security policymakers, the US military, and so forth are all recognizing that that is the tangled web that we live in today. And if you needed evidence for that, look no further than the 2025 Worldwide Threat Assessment, released by the Defense Intelligence Agency. The task for us today is to go through that document, read what the US national security folk actually think about the world, and also get some insight about how the United States might be changing its policies accordingly. And the critical theme that we will be exploring with this is that the Russian axis of influence, which seems like it is relatively strong, actually has a bunch of fragile and potentially fractured issue areas. That does not mean that the axis is about to fall apart, but it does place some critical limitations in what it can accomplish. But before we get into the actual reading, I think it is worth having a little bit of background about what this document actually is, because I know people are going to think to themselves, don't listen to what leaders say, watch what they do. And thus, we need to spend a moment to understand why looking at the words that are in these pages is actually worthwhile. If all you care about is the intelligence assessment itself, feel free to use the chapters function below to skip to that section. Otherwise, let's address this question of credibility. And the answer there is actually twofold. One, this is what you might think of as an agenda-setting document. It is released to the broader public because the United States government wants to have a larger conversation with individuals who are not just directly in the national security community, within the government or within think tanks within Washington, D.C., but also wants to engage a wider audience, including the public, including you who is listening to this video. Even if you might not necessarily read the document itself, you might get some information about it either through a video like this one, or alternatively through maybe a traditional news source who will have read what's in that document and may influence their reporting to some degree based on what's in that document. This is a common practice within democracies, because the bet is, with a little bit of additional transparency, the conversation and debate that can take place within the society will ultimately bring about better policy overall, and that is worth sacrificing, at least to some degree, some level of secrecy. That is aided by how most of the document's contents are assessments about what other countries think about the world and what other countries think that they are capable of doing out there in the world. This is not about to reveal information about the US government's private information. Things like how resolved the United States is to fight certain wars, or how many military deployments the United States has ready to go in particular regions. That type of stuff remains secret. Same as how the United States collected this information. It will not tell us why the United States believes Russia thinks something. It will just say that Russia thinks this. Then you can leave it up to yourself to imagine how it might have arrived at that assessment, either through maybe some leaks inside of the Kremlin, maybe there's some agents there, or maybe some satellite assessments, you name it. Doesn't matter. That part, the part that's sensitive, is not released in this. It is just the assessments themselves. Those points aside, the document itself is written by the Defense Intelligence Agency, one of the many intelligence agencies inside of the broader US national security sphere. But this one specifically is interested in trying to understand what is going on with militaries and handling military intelligence. The document's primary audience is the United States Congress, but it's written from the executive branch's point of view. That is because the Defense Intelligence Agency is a part of the Department of Defense. The Department of Defense is run by, the Secretary of Defense, that's Pete Hegseth, who is appointed by the executive, in this case Donald Trump. So to recap here, it is a document that comes from the executive branch ultimately, intended for the US Congress. As a result, within the document, you will see the executive making a pitch that the executive's policies are the correct policies, and there is a reason why the executive, as the commander-in-chief, is behaving in a particular way. Nevertheless, it is important to distinguish that inside of this document, there are going to be pitches like that, as well as more standard facts about what is true about U.S. national security intelligence assessments. by and large, we can trust that the factual assessments are accurate. Again, this is a document that is intended for Congress. There are members of Congress, both Republicans and Democrats, who consume it, and Republicans and Democrats who are aware of the intelligence reports that are private, that are classified, that we do not see, that might say things that are contradictory toward the factual statements within the National Intelligence Assessment. Consequently, if there were something wildly inaccurate about the factual portions of the report, then we would likely hear about it. And in all likelihood, it would be a Democrat inside of Congress who has access to the raw classified intelligence from which the document was created. That Democrat would raise their hand and say something along the lines of, "Hey, look, I know what is actually true here. The executive branch is trying to claim that we should do policies X and Y because of some factor Z. But factually speaking, they present a claim that Z is true, but we all know in Congress, those of us who have access to the classified reports, we all know that Z is not true, and thus the rest of this is nonsense." That means that the report has some sort of vetting process behind it, which is further reason why we in the broader public, who do not have security clearances and are just interested in national security affairs, we can trust that the factual parts of the document are accurate, but cognizant simultaneously of the fact that other parts of the document are trying to make a persuasive argument for the executive's policy. Actually, you can see the influence of the executive branch immediately when you open up the document's table of contents. You would think a document titled A Worldwide Threat Assessment would begin with maybe discussions of U.S. peer adversaries, say China and Russia, and then maybe after that get into some lower tier threats from other states. But no, that's not the case here. After one page of a basic introduction, the next page goes to, well, as you can see, the U.S. homeland and southern border. Thus, you can see the influence of the Trump administration before you even get to the substance of the document. All you have to do is look at that table of contents, recognize the order that things are being placed, and understand that the Trump administration is trying to convince individuals who are reading this that the U.S. homeland and southern border are a bigger priority and are more important than China or Russia. And just to be sure, I went back and I looked at the 2024 Worldwide Threat Assessment. The Defense Intelligence Agency releases one of these each year. But if you think about that year, 2024, it wasn't Trump who was president. It was still Biden. In turn, the Defense Intelligence Agency, as a part of the Department of Defense, and thus under the purview of the executive branch, is influenced by the president in the construction of the Worldwide Threat Assessment. And again, you can see that in 2024. So in 2024, when Biden was still president, what do you think the first thing of substance was in the table of contents? I bet you're going to guess something other than the U.S. homeland and southern border. And if that is what you are guessing, that's a good start because it was not, in fact, the homeland or the southern border. Well, I would be willing to bet that most of you had guessed Russia on that one. After all, Russia was in the middle and still is today a war with Ukraine. And that's a big priority for Europe and a big concern for the United States. But you would actually have been wrong if you guessed that. Even back during the Biden administration, the number one country-based priority was actually in agreement with the 2025 Worldwide Threat Assessment under Trump. That is China. China was the number one country-based threat even during the Biden administration. Why do I think this is worth making such a large point of emphasis? Well, the Trump administration gets a lot of criticism for its China-centric policy and its commitment to actually following through on that Indo-Pacific pivot. And we'll talk more, I suppose, as we go along about what exactly is going on in the Trump administration's mind when we start reading more about China and Russia inside of the 2025 Worldwide Threat Assessment. But it is worth highlighting and worth noting that even during the Biden administration, there was consensus that China was the bigger threat ultimately to U.S. national security. The big difference between the two administrations, of course, is exactly how focused they are on each of those topics. Because you can have consensus between Biden and Trump that China is, in fact, the more important threat of the two. But if they are both threats, then you need to start thinking about how to allocate your precious resources, which are scarce and cannot easily be increased, between defense against China and defense against Russia. And clearly the Trump administration is putting a lot more effort toward China, and basically at this point getting close to doing nothing in regard to Russia. So perhaps one thing to keep in the back of your mind as you are learning more about this document is that we have the Trump policy and the allocation strategy of the Trump administration on hand. And then, secondarily, we have the threat assessments that are contained in this document. And if everything is being done right in terms of policy, then the threats that are being made and the resources that are being allocated to those threats should be commensurate with one another. So, recapping here, if it's the case that we are really focusing as a country on China and not so much on Russia, it should be the case that as we read through this document, the threat that is being posed by China, as claimed in this document, should be much, much, much higher than the threat that is posed by Russia. But that's not the first thing in the document, is it? No, the first thing is the U.S. homeland and the southern border. The first subpoint within that section, though, is about missile threats, which talks about China and Russia and North Korea, all of which we'll get to eventually. Those are going to be 3 of the 4 main topics that we cover today. The next subpoint is about threats from ISIS and such, which, if you've lived in the United States for the last 24 or so years, you've become accustomed to this and you kind of know what the deal is there. The next page actually has something interesting here. It's the type of thing that anyone living in Ukraine or Russia would be well aware of, but something that people in the United States basically live in blissful ignorance of, and that is unmanned systems. Here it says, the threat posed by unmanned systems to DoD interests and the U.S. homeland probably will increase in coming years, driven by commercial demand, advances in the systems, and the difficulty in attributing intent to actors using these systems. That latter part is especially easy to overlook. It is not just that drones are very cheap, and so lots of people can get them, fly them into the United States, and perhaps do things that are not in the U.S. best interest. It is also that the United States is going to have a very difficult time attributing who is using these systems. You could imagine a situation where a drone flies over the southern border and conducts some sort of strike on a U.S. city or town nearby. All right, who did it? Well, it would be easy to say it came from the Mexican side of the border, so it was probably some group in Mexico. Maybe not the Mexican government, because that would be a little bit crazy, but perhaps some sort of cartel that has an issue with individuals in that particular city or town. They were trying to hunt down someone who had wronged them in some way, and a drone flying across the border was an easy way to do that. Okay, if that's your assessment, sure, very reasonable, but think about the perspective of someone sitting in Russia who might want to hurt the United States, but at the same time, doesn't want to be in a situation where it is going to be easy to attribute to Russia. Well, I just laid out a pretty good way of trying to do that. You could have a drone fly from Mexico and then damage the United States. And in that case, you're not trying to get into the United States to cause the damage. You have to go through Mexico, which might be a little bit easier for you to do. And it isn't much easier to resolve this problem if the target is, say, not individuals, but part of U.S. infrastructure. Maybe a critical portion of the U.S. power grid that causes power loss for thousands or perhaps millions. Now, that would be a very strange attack for a cartel to conduct, and it would be also very bizarre for Mexico's government to conduct that attack. But then, who is it? Is it Russia? Is it China? Is it North Korea? Is it Iran? Is it another country? Is it a non-state actor that wants to cause general damage to the United States? It's hard to figure that sort of thing out. I remember a time back in the early to mid-2000s when there was a belief in a lot of intelligence communities that advances in technologies like satellites had rendered the need for what they call in the industry human, or human intelligence. They had rendered human intelligence irrelevant. We could do such a good job looking from satellites that we did not need to have people on the ground informing the US government, or whichever intelligence agency you want to think about, informing them about what is happening. Now, that notion had pretty much been dispelled by the end of the 2000s. All of the effort that the United States put into penetrating militant groups made it clear that you can't just take pictures from the air to get a good picture of what's actually going on the ground. You need people on the ground to be able to do that, which means you have to rely on human intelligence. And I think that the proliferation of unmanned systems is pointing us in that direction as well. If you can't easily tell who used a drone to attack you by the technology itself, then you need to start understanding who is actually interested in attacking you and maybe have a mole on the inside who can feed you information that this particular organization within this particular country had a plan and hatched it properly to use a drone coming from Mexico to attack the United States. Then you have some idea who is actually committing the attack against you, which then means you can fight back. You can retaliate. And having the ability to retaliate is very important for getting deterrence to work. The rest of that page gets to the types of things that you might have thought that the Trump administration would have been particularly focused on if they wanted to lead off with the border. Illegal immigration, and then cartels and drug trafficking. Not much new to discuss here, though, so we'll just go ahead and move on. Moving along, you then have a nice transition chapter that gives you a big picture outlook at the threat situation revolving around state-level actors, kind of getting into that massive web that I led off this video with. And the focus is on the anti-US coalition that has kind of come together in the last few years. It's abbreviated CRINC. That would be China, Russia, Iran, and North Korea. Notably missing from this list is Yemen, which would get you the acronym CRINCY. And I think that's particularly fascinating for this subject, given that the document was being prepared during a time when the United States was engaged in major combat operations against just one enemy. And it wasn't China, it wasn't Russia, it wasn't Iran, and it wasn't North Korea. It was Houthis in Yemen. So it is interesting that Yemen is left off the list, and apparently not that much of a priority, despite the fact that the US was engaged with the Houthis. What this chapter attempts to do, though, is, again, to give you the big picture outlook of what's going on. What exactly is the coalition among those four countries, and what they are trying to do collectively and individually to disrupt US interests worldwide. The chapter has brief summaries for each country before there are individual chapters for each of these countries. I think it is worth going through the brief summary paragraphs before we get into more detail for each of the countries, because again, this provides a big picture overview about what the interconnected web of those countries looks like. Starting off with China, we have China will continue to advance selected areas of partnership with Russia, while avoiding actions such as overtly providing materiel or lethal military assistance to Russia that might elicit reputational or economic costs for Beijing. China legitimizes Russia's global actions by meeting with Russian leaders and working with Russia in various fora, such as the United Nations, BRICS, and the Association of Southeast Asian Nations. China is steadily expanding bilateral military exercises and operations with Russia, and conducted the first combined air and maritime patrols near the Arctic during the past year. So the main takeaway here is that the limitless friendship between China and Russia actually has quite a few limits. And that is, I think, an important distinction that is not fully appreciated about the anti-US and liberal order coalition, the CRINC countries, or the CRINCY countries, your choice, versus what goes on in the Western liberal order. By and large, within the Western coalition, there is a consensus on what the world should look like, and the problems that come along within that coalition are about who's going to put up the effort and the expenses to be able to reach the outcomes that the entire coalition benefits from. In contrast, the counter-coalition has four separate outlooks that are very different about what the world should be like. And for the most part, the reason why this works out for all of them is that the United States is leading an order that runs against all of their individual preferences and ideal outcomes. Moreover, what each of the counter-coalition countries seeks to get does not really interfere with the plans for the other members within that coalition. For example, if Russia captures Ukraine, that doesn't really hurt China very much, it doesn't really hurt Iran very much, it doesn't really hurt North Korea very much. And similarly, if China were to capture Taiwan, Russia doesn't really care very much, Iran doesn't really care very much, North Korea does not care very much. And so that is how, at some level, they can all get along. The drawback for this style of coalition, though, is that they are geared toward being an anti-coalition rather than a coalition that wants to work towards something. So North Korea is not particularly incentivized to exert great effort to help out China, or help out Iran, or help out Russia, unless they are getting something in it for themselves. When the United States helps out Canada, or Canada helps out the United States, or Germany helps out the United Kingdom, or the United Kingdom helps out Spain, or Spain helps out Italy. When the Western coalition is helping out one another, whenever one of them benefits, all of them benefit. With a counter coalition, though, everything has to be much more transactional. For Russia to benefit from something, it has to get something for itself. It can't have China obtain its own outcome and then Russia be happy as a result of that. So when you get those countries working together, again, it has to be transactional. Think about what's happening with North Korean troops inside of Russia. We'll get to that later on in this video. But there's a reason why North Korea is willing to go into Russia. It's not out of benevolence. It is because Russia is compensating North Korea for that. So getting back to how the document sees China and Russia's relationship here, it is not China going into, say, massive debt or taking great risks to help out Russia. It is helping Russia out on the margins, where it is not going to suffer a political blowback for doing so, and also is getting some sort of direct benefit for itself. For example, in the form of Russia having to sell cheap oil to China because there aren't very many alternatives to send that oil to. So, yes, China is helping out Russia, but in terms of actions such as overtly providing materiel or lethal military assistance to Russia, the answer there is no. China is happy with Russia taxing the Western coalition, and if China can help out Russia in that regard at a low cost to itself to cause an extra burden to the Western coalition, that ultimately is in China's best interest because China is an anti-Western actor. It is a part of a coalition that is anti the Western liberal order. It will pay those low costs to help out Russia to make a worse cost for the West. That it is perfectly happy to do. But in terms of actually providing lethal military assistance to Russia, where the United States is seeing, for example, China sending tanks or other types of actual materiel that is used to kill Ukrainians directly, China is not doing that yet, and does not seem to be doing that in the future, at least according to this threat assessment, because China does not want to be in a situation where it is paying extra political costs on the global market, on the global stage as a result of that. But is China willing to sell to Russia input goods that go into Russian weapons that are constructed in Russia and then ultimately sent over to Ukraine? Well, yes, of course. One, because that means China can profit from the trade. China is selling goods to Russia and making money. And two, because once more, that is going to cause problems for the Western coalition. And if China can make money while causing problems for the Western coalition, that sounds like a very good deal for Beijing. Now, this is not a philosophical outlook that's restricted to just China and Russia, that dyad of countries. It goes all across the coalition. At the end of this text, you can see this with North Korea and China. China will continue to block new efforts to sanction North Korea and blame the United States for failing to alleviate North Korea's security concerns. But here comes the big part. Even while China harbors strong security concerns of its own regarding North Korea. Sure, China and North Korea are happy to work together when it comes to the anti-Western coalition, but China still has reasons to be cautious about North Korea and vice versa. Moving on to Russia. Russia is aggressively seeking foreign support for its combat operations in Ukraine. North Korea and Iran separately supplement Russia's stressed military stockpiles. North Korea has shipped millions of artillery rounds and dozens of ballistic missiles to Russia during the past year, and has deployed more than 12,000 troops to fight for Russia against Ukraine. Iran continues to provide Russia armed unmanned aerial vehicles, all of which are being used against Ukrainian forces and civilians. Okay, let's pause for a moment here. None of that is new information, but I think it's worth trying to understand the distinction here between what North Korea and Iran are doing versus what China was unwilling to do. Because, as we just talked about a moment ago, China is not providing direct lethal aid to Russia, but North Korea and Iran are. The key difference between North Korea and Iran versus China is that North Korea and Iran are already locked into perhaps the world's largest sanctions regime ever created. Consequently, when North Korea and Iran provide direct lethal aid to Russia, there's not much that the Western coalition can do to punish those two countries, at least on the economic front. All of those buttons have already been pressed, and so if the West really wanted to punish North Korea or Iran, it would have to escalate to something more along the lines of military force, which brings in a whole host of new problems that the West is not yet eager to try to tackle. In contrast, the Western coalition hasn't really pressed those buttons against China. China has not been doing things over the last dozens of years that have upset the Western coalition to the extent that massive sanctions have been levied against the mainland. And in turn, that provides the West with leverage against China that the West does not have against the other countries because the West has already exhausted that leverage. However, this is still the transactional relationship at work. In return for all of those things that Russia has received, Russia is expanding its share of space, nuclear, and missile-applicable technology, expertise, and materials to China, Iran, and North Korea. I apologize for the construction of that sentence. Which will enable advancements in all three countries' weapons of mass destruction programs during the next 3 to 5 years. Again, those countries are happy to aid Russia, but they need to be compensated for it. Meanwhile, what's going on with Iran? Iran will seek cooperation with Russia, China, and North Korea to mitigate its diplomatic isolation and sanctions, though it probably will chafe at the limitations of those countries' support for some of Tehran's key regional interests. Iran will attempt to use its sale of UAVs and missiles to Russia as leverage to acquire advanced military technology, such as the Su-35 multi-role fighter. Iran has also expanded its military space program in the past 3 years, in part with Russia's assistance, and continues to develop space launch vehicle booster technologies that may shorten its pathway to fielding an ICBM if converted for that purpose. Well, that's a topic that often goes undiscussed about Iran's nuclear arc. There's a ton of discussion about Iran developing a nuclear weapon, but having a nuclear weapon doesn't do you very much good if you can only have the boom go boom on your own soil. In that regard, having access to an intercontinental ballistic missile is about as scary, or should be as scary from the Western perspective, as Iran developing a nuclear weapon itself. Because once Iran has mastered how to miniaturize a nuclear weapon and have it be robust enough to survive a rocket launch into space and then re-entry into Earth, suddenly the United States or Europe is facing a risk where at any given time, Iran could fire a nuclear weapon at one of those countries or at the continent of Europe and cause massive amounts of damage, as opposed to a situation where Iran has some sort of nuclear weapon but can only really kick it out of the back of a plane. That is far less concerning because if Iran were to try to use a nuclear weapon against the West, it would actually have to fly a plane over to wherever that weapon is going to be dropped and have that plane survive combat operations to get that far. The trouble for Iran is that developing space technology is incredibly expensive, and broadly speaking, the costs associated with deploying and maintaining delivery mechanisms for nuclear weapons tends to be way more expensive than the actual development process of the nuclear weapon itself. And the next passage from the report is actually getting at some issues with that Iran has an inability to pay for these sorts of things, and has thus been relying on recently Russia for assistance because Iran has access to weapons programs that Russia needs right now on the battlefield in Ukraine, and can use that as leverage to convince Moscow to help it out with these more sensitive technology areas such as ICBMs. But once more, we run into problems with the internal politics of the anti-Western coalition. During the next 2 years, Iran's defense spending probably will stagnate and compel it to focus on seeking other suppliers, such as China, or acquiring lower-cost military equipment to meet its needs. China has thus far been reticent to transfer advanced military equipment to Iran, probably because of the threat of sanctions and not wanting to disrupt ties with its other partners in the Middle East. Again, China willing to help out its partners to make the West have a little bit worse of a life, but not willing to pay direct costs itself if it's going to be a high cost to get to those outcomes. And I think if we read what's going on with North Korea here, we get basically the entire picture from the other three countries repeated in the same sort of general framework. North Korea almost certainly is receiving reciprocal military cooperation from Moscow, including SA-22 surface-to-air missile systems and electronic warfare equipment, for providing soldiers and materiel to support Russia's war against Ukraine. North Korea has strengthened its relationship with Russia by signing a comprehensive strategic partnership agreement last year, which includes mutual defense assurances. With China, North Korea's critical economic and political dependence on China underpins the bilateral relationship. The countries have maintained a mutual defense treaty since 1961, but have virtually no military cooperation. North Korea's engagement with Russia probably reflects an attempt to counterbalance China's leverage over Pyongyang. I think it is worth ending this section with a note of caution. Just because there are fractures in the bilateral relationships of the anti-Western coalition does not mean that the United States is going to be very easily able to exploit those fractures. The general problems that those countries have with the West far exceed the problems that they have internally within the coalition. So what we're going to get is a loose coalition, a federation of those countries that are working against the United States and the West. But we're not going to have a situation where the United States is actually going to be able to drive a wedge between any of the two. Okay, zooming out, I realize that we have a bit of a problem here. We're 30 minutes into the analysis of the 2025 Worldwide Threat Assessment, and we have made it through pages 5 and 6. There's a whole bunch more to talk about here, including some table of contents stuff that I haven't even listed because the table of contents goes on to a second page. But for the most part, what the rest of this document does is focus on the individual areas and talk specifically about what's going on along those issue areas, like what China is thinking about Taiwan, what Russia is thinking about Ukraine, and so forth. So I think having spent the bulk of our time talking about the big picture is ultimately worthwhile because it gives you, as the name implies, the big picture. But I do want to spend a little bit of time talking about the more specific targeted areas of China, Russia, Iran, and North Korea to finish up here. For China, I want to focus on 3 issue areas: military modernization, nuclear capabilities, and Taiwan. For military modernization, the report says that China is rapidly advancing its military modernization and developing capabilities across all warfare domains that could enable it to seize Taiwan by force, to better project power in the Western Pacific, and to disrupt U.S. attempts to maintain presence or intervene in conflict in the Indo-Pacific region. China's leaders are stressing the imperative of meeting key military transformation targets set for 2027 and 2035. These milestones seek to align the transformation of China's People's Liberation Army with its other national modernization efforts, which include advancing a new type of international relations, being actively involved in global governance, and unification with Taiwan. What I want to focus on here are those specific years, 2027 and 2035. You will often see years like that cited in reports such as the one that we are reading. Sometimes you'll see it in media analysis as well, and in even crazier situations, you'll see very specific dates being cited. That happens relatively frequently with the war in Ukraine right now, where the Kremlin will set specific dates for Russian troops to capture some city inside of Ukraine. What I want to highlight here is the fact that you should not take these years or these dates whenever you see this in an intelligence report, in a media analysis, in whatever. You should not take them to be specific dates where things are actually going to happen. That is not what these things are. What these things actually are rallying cries. The Chinese government is setting a date of 2027 or 2035 for its military to meet certain goals. It is a challenge from the government to its military leaders to do this, this, and this by 2027. Put differently, these years are meant for domestic consumption, not international consumption. It is a goal that China is setting for the Russian military. The government wants to see this and this by 2027 and is challenging the military to accomplish that goal. It would be nice from the Chinese government's perspective if the military beats that goal, but if the military fails in doing that, it is not as if passing 2027 is going to be some sort of relief from the international perspective, that the United States has finally survived through 2027, everything is fine. Or the United States has gotten through 2035, it is now 2036, China is no longer a threat. That's not what's happening here. It is not like if the PLA misses those dates, the West is out of the woods. The PLA will keep working on that, and suddenly now 2028 is the problem year, or 2037 is the problem year. Something like that. That is something that you should always keep in mind whenever you see something like this. And again, it happens all the time right now with Russia and Ukraine. it is best to hear those dates and take them with a grain of salt and then move on with your life. Otherwise, you will get caught up in that annual tradition where everyone in the media and various pundits online will tell you that everything is going to happen on Victory Day, only for Victory Day to come and go without very much happening with Russia. The next topic, though, has a much bigger boom. We're switching to nuclear capabilities. China's nuclear warhead stockpile probably has surpassed 600 operational nuclear warheads. We estimate that China will have more than 1,000 operational nuclear warheads by 2030, much of which will be deployed at higher readiness levels for faster response times, and will continue growing its force until at least 2035. This supports the PLA's objective to achieve a more diverse nuclear force, comprising systems including low-yield precision strike missiles and ICBMs with multi-megaton yields, to provide a broader range of nuclear response options. By comparison, Russia has about 4,000 operational nuclear warheads. And so, really, this modernization process of China's nuclear forces is also China taking a step toward being the full-on replacement for Russia in terms of global superpower competition. But the main event is Taiwan. China is likely to continue its campaign of diplomatic, information, military, and economic pressure on Taiwan to advance its long-term objective of unification with Taiwan, deter any move by Taiwan toward independence, and test the United States' commitment to Taiwan's defense. China possesses a variety of military options to coerce Taiwan, including increasing the frequency and scope of China's military presence operations, air and maritime blockades, seizure of Taiwan's smaller outlying islands, joint firepower strikes, and a full-scale amphibious invasion of Taiwan. China appears willing to defer seizing Taiwan by force, as long as it calculates unification ultimately can be negotiated. The costs of forcing unification continue to outweigh the benefits, and its stated red lines have not been crossed by Taiwan or its partners and allies. I think it is worth underscoring the underlying risk of a conflict between China and Taiwan, because that is something that flies under the media's radar. Whenever there are actual bombs going off, the media's attention is going to be diverted to that, which means for the last 3 years we've had a pretty steady flow of information coming out of Ukraine about what Russia is up to there. But as a point of comparison, think about the conflict between India and Pakistan from a couple of weeks ago. That was like a flash in the media pan. It came and went in a couple of days. And you would think, based on that everything around there has pretty much resolved itself and they've gone back to having a relatively normal status quo between those two countries. That's not true. The bombs may have stopped falling, but the tensions are still there. There is still a high underlying risk of conflict between the two. We just don't hear about it because, again, as long as the bombs are not going off, you're not going to see very much attention paid to those particular issue areas in the news. But in some ways, the situation between China and Taiwan is worse. Sure, they haven't bombed each other recently like India and Pakistan have, but it's almost a constant occurrence that China is buzzing up against Taiwan's airspace, or approaching the line of control, at least a theoretical line of control, along the Taiwan Strait. So one of these situations at any given moment could erupt into something a lot bigger, and we're not hearing about it yet because no one is dying, and you need it to bleed for it to lead the news. But once you understand just how frequent there are potential flashpoints between the two, you might start having a better understanding why, even during the Biden administration, China was listed first in this intelligence report over Russia. And you might also have a greater appreciation how there could be some sort of larger conflict in the Indo-Pacific region in the next few years. But I suppose Russia remains the main event, precisely because the bombs are still flowing into Ukraine. And in that regard, the report has some major information, some actual intelligence estimates from the United States government about what is going on inside of the minds of the Kremlin. Here we go. Russian President Vladimir Putin regards the war in Ukraine as an existential struggle against the West that will determine Russia's place in the world, Putin's hold on power, and his historical legacy. Putin remains confident in Russia's ultimate victory in Ukraine and is prepared to use military force at least through 2025. Putin also remains steadfast in his demand that Ukraine be permanently prohibited from joining the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, while insisting Kyiv withdraw all of its military forces from Donetsk, Luhansk, Zaporizhia, and Kherson Oblasts. Those are the 4 oblasts along the eastern front inside of Ukraine that Russia, by Russian Federation law, says are a part of Russia. Meanwhile, Putin is almost certainly committed to victory in Ukraine, and his objectives remain mostly unchanged since the beginning of the war: Ukrainian neutrality and a further partition of the Ukrainian state. In the absence of a negotiated settlement, or alternatively, robust Western aid, the battlefield outlook probably will continue to slowly trend in Russia's favor through 2025, though Russian battlefield gains are slowing and continue to come at the expense of high personnel and equipment losses. Now, I should pause a moment here to point out that the intelligence report was created using intelligence all the way through May 11th. That was the cutoff point. And presumably before May 11th, the United States was well aware that Russia was intending to start a larger scale offensive sometime during that month. So when we just read that passage, the expectation about what Russia is going to do on the battlefield should have already incorporated expectations about the offensive that is currently underway. Nonetheless, I think it is worth pointing that out because we might get some sort of sense about whether this intelligence report is correct based off of what we're seeing on the battlefield in the next few weeks. The next bit of the passage gives us some insight into what U.S. estimates are of Russian losses. Since the war's start, Russia has lost at least 10,000 ground combat vehicles, including more than 3,000 tanks, as well as nearly 250 aircraft and helicopters, and more than 10 naval vessels. Russia has experienced more than 700,000 personnel casualties during the war. Emphasis here on casualties; those are not fatalities. That is a combination of fatalities and other sorts of injuries. Nonetheless, that is a huge number, and it should make you think a little bit harder about how deep Russia is having to go into the recruitment pool to be able to convince more individuals to go over to Ukraine. Not only is it going to cost Russia more to be able to do that, think about the individuals that they're going to be getting. Those were individuals that were reluctant to go over there in the first place and needed to be paid a large sum of money to be convinced otherwise. I'm going to have a much larger video on this subject coming up in the next week or two on the main channel, but there is a general problem that Russia is going to face, that those individuals who are going to be recruited over the next few months or maybe even the next few years, they're going to be less committed than the individuals that they've been able to previously recruit for less money. The rest of this is just providing detail on the situation. Russian forces maintain small, incremental progress toward capturing portions of Donetsk and Luhansk oblasts and expelling Ukrainian forces from Kursk Oblast. Yes, there's still a small portion of Ukrainian soldiers still in Kursk. To this end, Russia introduced more than 10,000 North Korean soldiers along the Kursk salient to support Russian offensive operations. Simultaneously, Russia is targeting critical Ukrainian infrastructure with a combination of one-way attack UAVs and long-range missiles to degrade its national will to fight. So that's the big picture outlook of the war in Ukraine. Russia still thinks it's capable of doing this even if it's going to come at a high cost, which means it is up to the West to convince Russia that Russia is wrong with that assessment. Next up, 3 points about Iran, and hopefully they will be relatively quick. Iran almost certainly will attempt to rearm Hezbollah and continue providing lethal aid to Iraqi Shia militias, Syrian militants, and the Houthis to impose costs on Israel and threaten U.S. interests. The Houthis resumed strikes in March 2025 following Israel's resumption of combat operations in Gaza. This follow-on part is interesting because it confirms something that you probably already suspected. The Houthis have asserted that de-escalation is contingent upon ceasefires in Gaza and Lebanon, the resumption of humanitarian aid to pre-war levels, and the cessation of U.S.-led strikes in Yemen. However, the group probably will consider similar attacks in the future, including attacks on U.S. ships and persons, to press for greater international legitimacy or extort shipping companies for protection from strikes. Remember that this document was prepared using intelligence up to May 11th. That's 5 days after Trump declared that the operations against the Houthis along the Red Sea had been successful, and the United States was going to start drawing down those operations. Well, this report suggests that, in fact, the situation has not gotten very much better, which is also consistent with some New York Times reporting on what was going on inside of the Trump administration, and the decision to withdraw being geared more toward making sure that everything was going to be fine in terms of U.S. military capacity to fight against China, and not exhausting U.S. capacity inside of the Red Sea. But of course, we have to finish with nuclear weapons. Iran almost certainly is not producing nuclear weapons, but Iran has undertaken activities in recent years that better position it to produce them, if it chooses to do so. Since 2019, Iran conducted activities that exceed previous Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action limits, including increasing the size and enrichment levels of its uranium stockpile, producing small quantities of uranium metal, restricting International Atomic Energy Agency monitoring to pre-JCPOA levels, and expanding uranium enrichment at its Fordow fuel enrichment plant. Let me just pause there and explain a brief technical point. The uranium enrichment facilities that you hear so much about, and perhaps you have a visual memory of those centrifuges that spin around to separate out the uranium that's not suitable for a nuclear weapon from the pure uranium-235 that is super fissile. That sort of process requires a uranium gas. And once you have a sufficient concentration of uranium-235, you don't turn that gas into a nuclear weapon. You have to take that gas and turn it back into a metal. The metal is what is fitted into a nuclear weapon. So there is a concern there that you're taking another step toward a bomb, namely metallicizing the uranium that Iran has purified. This next part is an important point, though. These actions reduce the time required to produce sufficient weapons-grade uranium for a first nuclear device to probably less than 1 week. Let me follow that up with a note of caution and a note of concern. First, the caution. It's important to understand exactly what that is saying and what it is not saying. Because if you read that very quickly, you might think to yourself, it says that Iran could develop a nuclear weapon in 1 week, if it so chooses. Noting at the beginning of this statement, it said that Iran almost certainly is not producing nuclear weapons. In other words, the choice has not yet been made by the government to produce nuclear weapons, but reading further along in this, you might think to yourself, when the government chooses to do so, it will take 1 week. Well, no, that is not what it is saying. It is saying that it will take 1 week to produce the fuel for the nuclear weapon. After you have the fuel, you actually have to put it into a bomb that works and is functional. And it's not as clear what the timeline looks like on that front. And certainly what we're seeing inside of this document is not giving us better information about that. But now for the note of caution. And this is a topic that we've talked about relatively recently. If you go back to that interview I did with Matt Furman just a few weeks ago, one of the points that we talked about there was there comes a point somewhere along the proliferation process where a potential proliferator is so far along that other countries might as well start treating that potential proliferator as an actual nuclear weapons country. And I know this is going to run against what I just said a moment ago, but imagine for a second that it literally was just 1 week until Iran had a functioning nuclear weapon. How is that much different from Iran having a nuclear weapon right now? Not much. It is somewhat different on the margins. For example, if the United States launched a whole bunch of nuclear weapons at Iran to completely destroy Iran, Iran needing 1 week to develop and finish a nuclear weapon would not have a nuclear weapon to fire back at the United States or even Israel or other U.S. interests in the region. But absent something spectacular like that, the difference between having a nuclear weapon right now and having a nuclear weapon a week from now is fairly marginal, especially when it comes to preventive war. Think about some sort of military action by the United States or perhaps alternatively Israel that is designed to stop Iran from being able to acquire a nuclear weapon. Well, that might work out very well if Iran is many years away from developing a nuclear weapon, and all you have to do is destroy a couple of facilities and you're done. Even if you don't fully destroy them, it's not a big deal. You've still enfeebled Iran enough that Iran is going to be much delayed in making progress toward a nuclear weapon. In contrast, if Iran is only 1 week away from developing a nuclear weapon, that's a whole different ballgame. All Iran has to do is protect a couple of key facilities, or maybe even smaller scale materials that could be moved around. All Iran has to do is protect those for a week. And suddenly, after 1 week, the entire war process that Israel or the United States was undergoing to try to stop Iran from developing a nuclear weapon, at that point, the process is shot. So, all told, it would be very interesting to know a little bit more about where the United States or Israel is in that preventive war process and where Iran is in its actual development of a deliverable nuclear weapon, which again is different than some sort of estimate about the fueling of a nuclear weapon. But that's starting to broach the area of more sensitive intelligence information, which is why we're not seeing it in this public report. Finally, one simple note about North Korea. In late 2023, North Korea completed its only successful launch of a domestic SLV, that would be a space launch vehicle for us normies, placing its only operational satellite into low Earth orbit. After the launch, North Korea threatened to destroy U.S. spy satellites if the United States, quote, tries to violate the legitimate territory, end quote, of North Korea, referring to its satellite program. North Korea's ballistic missiles and SLVs could be used as a very basic anti-satellite platform to target U.S. and partner satellites in a conflict. Additionally, North Korea has received an offer from Russia to assist its space program, including SLVs, satellites, and training. What I want to point out here is just how problematic it would be if North Korea starts using missiles to target satellites. And it does not matter whether we are talking about a U.S. spy satellite, a U.S. civilian satellite, or anyone else's satellite for any purpose whatsoever. When a missile goes and targets one of these satellites in space, colloquially, it's fine to say that you're shooting them down. But in practice, they're not actually coming back down to Earth. What's going to happen instead is that you will have a whole bunch of debris that is in space and is going to remain in orbit. And that, unfortunately, creates problems for everyone who is trying to use space. Suddenly, you have to be worried about the debris making contact with other satellites, causing some sort of chain reaction event, which would be really, really bad. And even absent that sort of huge concern, whenever you're launching something else into space, now you have to be cognizant of where every single piece of debris is to make sure that the new satellite or the new launch that's going to the moon or to Mars or wherever is not going to make contact with that debris, causing problems with the delivery of whatever it is that you're trying to get to space or the moon or to Mars. So sure, North Korean nuclear weapons are scary, especially if you're living in Seoul, right across the North Korean border. But now with the ability, or relatively soon the ability, of North Korea to be able to get stuff way up into space, the United States, the West, even Russia and other partner countries like China all have to be concerned about North Korea having this leverage over other countries and the concerns that go for everyone as a result of that. And I think that's a good place to stop. The document itself has a whole bunch more depth to it. I am now showing you the rest of the table of contents on the screen. And if you're interested in reading more about those other issue areas like Latin America or the Middle East or Africa or wherever else, or you want to learn more about what was actually talked about with North Korea, Iran, Russia, or China, good news. It's a public document, like I said. You can check the video description to get more information about it. There's going to be a link there. You can read it all for yourself. For now, though, I hope you enjoyed this video, and if you did, please like, share, and subscribe, and I'll see you next time. Take care.